James H. Meredith is formally enrolled at the University of Mississippi, ending one chapter in the federal government's efforts to desegregate the university. The town of Oxford is an armed camp, following riots that accompany the registration of the first Negro in the university's 118-year history. Much of this film record was destroyed when our cameraman, Gordon Yoder, was attacked, but he did salvage pictures of Governor Ross Barnett at the scene. The governor fought the court order long and bitterly before modifying his stand, saying Mississippi was overpowered by the federal government. President Kennedy appealed to the students and to the people of the state to comply peacefully with the law and bring the crisis to an end. Even as he talked, riots were breaking out in Oxford.
Americans are free and sure to disagree with the law, but not to disobey it. For any government of laws and not of men, no man, however prominent or powerful, and no mob, however unruly or boisterous, is entitled to defy a court of law. If this country should ever reach the point where any man or group of men, by force or threat of force, could long deny the commands of our court and our Constitution, then no law would stand free from doubt. No judge would be sure of his writ, and no citizen would be safe from his neighbors.
Nearly 6,000 troops patrol Oxford to maintain order, and arrests mount to more than 200 as smaller disturbances erupt the next day. Former Major General Edwin Walker, who came here from his home in Texas, is put under arrest and held in high bail on charges of inciting insurrection. He was flown to a federal prison hospital as relative calm settled on the town in the greatest crisis the South has faced since the Civil War.
So I had one or two questions, and just to be clear, when we're done with this, I will go back there and I'll stay here as long as people want to sign a book. So, but I want to begin by setting the scene a little bit for what I'm going to read by saying that my first awareness of the great difficulty the white church had with the race issue came when I was 9 years old in October 1963, when I witnessed a group of 2 black college students and 1 white college student, all 3 were women, and 2 white ministers from Illinois get arrested at the front steps of my family's church, Capitol Street Methodist in downtown Jackson, Mississippi, simply because they tried to come to worship that morning. I didn't become aware of the born of conviction statement until I transferred to Millsaps College as a junior in 1975 and became friends with Sid Connor, whose father James was one of the signers of the born of conviction statement and stayed in Mississippi as a pastor, and Jim Matheny, whose grandfather J.P. Stafford publicly endorsed born of conviction as the Mississippi Conference lay leader and suffered some consequences for that support. Then in 1983, when I was a United Methodist pastor in Mississippi, my mother Jerry had become the Mississippi Conference archivist, and so for the first time I saw a copy of the statement. I saw it in the actual issue of the Mississippi Methodist Advocate and made a photocopy of it. When I came to Emory and Henry in 1990, I occasionally used that statement in classes as a case study of the clash between culture and the Christian faith. Finally, in 2003, I started the research on the book by beginning to do interviews with some of the surviving signers. My dad, who died in September 2014, was an important conversation partner for me for several years as I was trying to make sense of all of 1960s Mississippi and of Mississippi Methodism. Dad has been in my dreams lately, including one where he actually congratulates me on the publication of the book. So I think my mother is right that he is here today with us. This is a new experience for me, and I've given a lot of thought to what I would read to you today. What selection from the book would be the best representation of this incredibly complex story? Well, there were lots of candidates. Last Monday at Emory and Henry, I chose to read from the introduction of the book, which connects this story to the larger narrative of the civil rights movement and debates among movement historians about the role of religion as a motivation for all the people involved in the struggles of the 1950s and 60s in the Deep South. I was tempted to read from part one to give you a sense of the ways white Mississippi Methodism was strongly influenced by the massive resistance to any change in race relations in Mississippi after the 1954 Brown decision, or to give you a taste of the craziness of Mississippi in 1962, when in order to keep one black man, James Meredith, out of Ole Miss, the state went to absurd lengths and fostered the atmosphere, resulting in a deadly riot on the Ole Miss campus on the night of September 30th, 1962. I could also have shared with you some fascinating examples of how the ministers who signed the Born of Conviction statement were influenced by their families, by their white Mississippi Methodist churches, and their education to take a stand against that massive resistance craziness. I could have read about the decision of 4 young Mississippi Methodist ministers to write the Born of Conviction statement in October 1962 after the Ole Miss riot because of their frustration that leaders of their annual conference had said nothing in response to what can justifiably be called the idolatry of Mississippi Methodism. The insistence, and of white Mississippi in general, the insistence on maintaining the segregated system, whatever the cost. Those 4 young ministers wrote a statement speaking for church people who felt intense anguish at this situation, but also felt powerless to respond. Board of Conviction called for freedom of the pulpit, quoted the Methodist discipline's insistence that the teachings of Jesus did not allow for discrimination because of race, expressed support for the public schools and opposition to their closing when inevitable desegregation came, and asserted the signers' opposition to communism, since it was common for anyone challenging the status quo in those days in Mississippi to be called a communist. A total of 28 ministers from the white Mississippi Conference, the southern half of the state then, signed the statement, and it was published on January 2nd, 1963. I considered reading from the 2 chapters describing the complex response to the statement. Some public endorsement from a few people, but mostly public objection and rejection, including the immediate departure of 3 of the signers from their churches. Most of the signers received anonymous threats, and many were ostracized in their churches. But the story of the response is even more complex because they also got a lot of private letters expressing support for what they had done. I was tempted to offer some of the powerful accounts of the experiences of family members of the signers and how what happened in 1963 still prompts both pain and intense pride in the courage of their husbands or fathers and mothers. I could also have read from the many stories of what became of the signers. Ultimately, 20 of the 28 left Mississippi, most within a year and a half of the statement's publication. They left for all kinds of reasons, more complex than simply they spoke out and were forced out of Mississippi because of their stand on race relations. But this is a story that has continued. And many of the most real and compelling stories continue unfolding for years, even decades after they begin. The Born of Conviction has been told mostly as a narrative of forced departure from Mississippi, and that element is often exaggerated. Consider these three mentions of the statement in published books. The first, when 28 young Methodist ministers in Mississippi signed a mild statement regarding the University of Mississippi desegregation crisis, all of them were gone within the year. The second, 28 Methodist ministers once lost their churches in Mississippi for a stand on the race issue. And the third one, all of the signers were run out of Mississippi. The problem with these accounts is that they aren't true. There's truth in them, but they aren't true, among other reasons, because 8 of the signers never left Mississippi and remained in ministry there until they retired. I believe telling the full story makes it more powerful. So I'm going to read you 2 sections from the 10th chapter of the book and just a couple of little explanations. I'm going to mention the 28, that is a reference to the signers. I'm going to mention Medgar Evers, the African-American leader of the Jackson Civil Rights Movement, who was murdered in June of 1963. I'm also going to mention J.P. Stafford, W.B. Sela, and Sam Ashmore. Stafford was the conference lay leader who publicly supported Born of Conviction. W.B. Sela was the pastor of Galloway Church in downtown Jackson, the largest church in Mississippi Methodism. He came out about 3 days after the statement was published with a stronger statement, basically saying we should voluntarily desegregate all public accommodations now. And Sam Ashmore, who was the editor of the Mississippi Methodist Advocate, which published the statement. So, the title of Chapter 10 is Assessing and Remembering Born of Conviction. And I'm going to read the 2 epigraphs. The first one is from Jim Waits, one of the people who wrote the statement, and he's one who left Mississippi. I would say that for me, even though now I consider it a very modest kind of effort and intervention, it has been a kind of touchstone for what I've seen as my ministry in subsequent times, and I would bet that most of the others feel the same way. And of course, he's talking about his signing and participating in Born of Conviction. The second epigraph is from John Ed Thomas, one of the 8 signers who stayed in Mississippi, and he's also speaking about Born of Conviction and his participation. After I left Satartia, this was put behind me, and we went on to other things. It's kind of like a mosquito nip now. It stung and hurt a little bit then, but it doesn't amount to anything now. So the first of the two sections is called Formal Recognition at Last. Shortly before 10 o'clock on Sunday, June 9th, the last day of the 2013 Mississippi Annual Conference session at the Convention Center in downtown Jackson, several hundred ministers and laypersons watched and listened to the Emma Elsie Award presentation. Given each year by the Conference Commission on Religion and Race, the award celebrates reconciliation by honoring persons who have contributed significantly to the improvement of race relations in Mississippi. On stage were 8 signers of the Born of Conviction Statement, along with Bishop James E. Swanson Jr., the first African-American bishop assigned to any conference in Mississippi since the 1968 abolition of the segregated central jurisdiction, and the first black Episcopal leader ever to preside over white Methodists in the state. Timothy Thompson, the bishop's administrative assistant, a clergy post, and also an African American, introduced the award recipients and characterized them as, quote, bold individuals who took a stand when others could not, when others would not. As their names were read aloud, a picture of each of the 28 signers appeared on large screens in the hall, along with photos of J.P. Stafford, W.B. Sela, and Sam Ashmore. In addition to the 8 signers present, seated down front were the wives of 5 of the signers on stage, plus the widows of 4 other signers. Another 45 family members also attended, including 25 adult children of signers. This event commemorated 3 50th anniversaries. The 28 were nominated for the Elsie Award to mark the 50 years since their witness. In addition, the conference invited Myrlie Evers to participate, and Bishop Swanson read a letter celebrating Medgar Evers' courageous leadership, because the coming week marked 50 years since his assassination. Mrs. Evers spoke to the gathering to express her thanks for the message of unity, honoring her husband and his legacy, and then she posed for a photograph with the bishop, Thompson, and the 8 Born of Conviction signers present. There was no mention of the 3rd anniversary. On this very morning in 1963, Galloway Church ushers turned away 5 Tougaloo students who sought to attend worship after they had been rebuffed at First Baptist, and Galloway pastors W.B. Sela and Jerry Furr resigned in protest. With only 2.5 days to complete all conference business, those who designed the award ceremony sought a balance between adequate commemoration of the occasion, celebration of both the Born of Conviction Statement and the heroic leadership and vision of Mr. Evers, and the need to adjourn early that afternoon after completion of remaining agenda items. Thus, 2 of the 8 signers present, Maxie Dunham and Keith Tonkel, were asked to accept the award for the 28. Dunham spoke first and invoked words from the 17th century Carmelite, Brother Lawrence, "God, you have outwitted me." Dunham continued, 50 years ago, some young men, now old men, signed a statement, and now this annual conference is saying, we appreciate that. God outwits us. That's the storyline of the Christian faith and way. God continually outwits us. There have been times since that occasion, many of us left the state, when I have been most pleased with the faithfulness of people like Keith Tonkel, who stayed in the state. And there have been occasions when I have felt guilty for having left and wondered what God was doing with that. But God outwits us. When you think about the contribution that those who left the state have made to the whole church, you know what I mean when I say God outwits us. 2 of those persons became presidents of seminaries. 2 of them became deans of seminaries. 3 of them became pastors of some of the largest churches in the denomination. Others were not only in their general conference delegations, some of them led their delegations. God outwits us. At the end of his remarks, Dunham expressed appreciation on behalf of himself and Tonkel. The 2 shook hands with Mrs. Evers, who had been standing behind them. After Mrs. Evers' speech and the photo, the conference sang, "Blessed be the tie that binds," as the group left the stage. Signers and family members gathered in a nearby room, and a family member of one who stayed in Mississippi privately expressed anger and disappointment at the ceremony's lack of recognition of those who had remained in the state. Another such family member wrote, quote, "And having one of the 28 who bailed out speak for the whole group was, I found, disrespectful of those who chose the more difficult path." Although Dunham did briefly praise the signers who had stayed and offered the litany of accomplishments by those who had left as an example of triumph in the face of adversity through the power of God, the critics heard it as perpetuating the narrative that the Born of Conviction story centers on those who left the state. The conference had not intentionally slighted those who remained, and Tonkel had intended to speak briefly as their representative. However, he had recently undergone cancer treatments, and it remained uncertain until that morning whether he would even be able to attend. He chose not to speak because he felt the time pressure. The persons who planned the event could not know of the emotional minefield it would expose, and they were not responsible for the conference's lack of acknowledgement of the signers over the previous 50 years. This was the first time the Mississippi Conference had formally celebrated the 1963 Born of Conviction witness. 50 years of pent-up feelings resulting from lack of recognition in Mississippi could not be put to rest with one 30-minute ceremony. And the expressions of anger illustrate one of the central aspects of the Born of Conviction story, the experiential divide between the signers who left and those who stayed. The next section I'm going to read is called Touchstone or Mosquito Nip, Divergence of Experience and Interpretation. In 2003, Jim Waits described his participation in the Born of Conviction statement as a touchstone for his ministry. Quote, "Though it was a modest statement, it was that occasion when we knew that there was a reason for being a minister of the gospel, and that there was a direct conflict between that and the ways of the world and the ways of society. And that was clear. What came out of that for me was a sense that whatever you do in ministry, whatever you do in the life of the church, it ought to go back and be tested by the scriptures and by theological perception." This view resounded from other signers in 2004. James Nicholson, who left, said simply, quote, "The most important thing I ever did was to sign that statement." Jerry Trigg, who also left, called it, quote, "the defining moment of my ministry, my view of the ministry, my view of the church, my view of what my role is. It can all be defined by what we did there." In a 1963 letter to his former students among the 28, Candler professor Theodore Runyon predicted their participation would be, quote, "one of the most significant acts of your ministry." This interpretation of the experience is more prevalent among signers who left Mississippi. Compare John Ed Thomas's claim at the 2005 Born of Conviction reunion that his membership in the 28 had become like a mosquito nip and doesn't amount to anything now. He certainly valued the experience, quote, "I'll always be proud of what I did to take that kind of a stand. At that moment, I was so young, I didn't know whether it was courage or stupidity. But I sort of melded them together and put my name on the line and went forward for what it was worth." But for him, it was not a touchstone. His proudest achievement was staying in the state, quote, "to serve the church here." The difference between those who left and those who stayed showed clearly at the 2005 reunion. With one exception, the 8 Mississippi exiles at that event each took longer to tell their stories than the 4 present who stayed. For most of the ministers who left, Born of Conviction became the occasion for a new and exciting life in an environment much less confining than Mississippi. They benefited greatly from opportunities unavailable to them in their home state. Their new conferences not only recognized and valued their talents, but in most cases, the embattled former Mississippians were celebrated as heroes for their January 1963 witness and given opportunities to tell their stories to sympathetic audiences. By contrast, Mississippi Methodists did not want to hear from the signers, at first because church members either remained angry or silent about the controversy, and later because it represented an embarrassment that they preferred to forget. Elsewhere, Born of Conviction was a hero story, and its participants were lauded and even lionized. In Mississippi, it soon became a dangerous memory, something suppressed deep in the collective Methodist, United Methodist psyche and never acknowledged publicly. Thus, the anger of family members and some of the signers who stayed is not only directed at those who left, but is also an expression of long frustration at lack of recognition for their witness due to the collective burying of the story in Mississippi. The 1963 controversy was painful for all the signers, but those who stayed never spoke about their experience for the most part. Clint Gill, close friend of both James Conner and N.A. Dixon, says that neither of them ever talked about Born of Conviction. In 2004 at Parkway Heights Church in Hattiesburg, Rod Entrican told his story related to those 1963 events. It was the first time he had spoken of it in public in 40 years. Keith Tonkel also had not talked about it. When the story made the news in 2005 related to the reunion of signers in Jackson, many members at Wells Church, where he had served since 1969, learned about it for the first time. An Associated Press reporter in Jackson interviewed Tonkel for a story published the morning of the reunion, and she quoted his comments about having stayed when others left. Quote, "I said to them, I'm only signing this thing with the understanding we're committed to staying in Mississippi. How can you flesh out a conviction if you're absent? I thought our responsibility was to see what we can create that would be inclusive." Knowing that attendees had likely read the story, he began his remarks at the reunion with the claim that he had not sought the interview and the reporter had left out an important preamble that recognized the range of experiences. Quote, "Every single one of us in that group had to walk in their own integrity." Denson Napier, a signer who stayed, avoided the reunion because he saw Born of Conviction as past history. The resentment comes as no surprise to some of the exiles. In 2004, Ed McRae commented, "It's true, I didn't have to leave Mississippi. I can understand that kind of judgment. You think of us as a group leaving, probably most of us wound up with a better life because we left. It was almost like a stepping stone that we signed the statement. It was advantageous for my career." Inman Moore offered a similar view, quote, "I haven't so much heard it as I suspected that might be the feelings. The people that did stay, like Elton Brown and Rod Entrican, they have never personally said it. and I've gone back to visit them. But I think it's an understandable feeling. If I had been one, particularly that may have been dumped on and stayed and really felt the wrath of the powers that be, if I were in that position, I might say, well, here I am staying the course, and that Inman Moore is out in California basking in the sun. In summary, those who left escaped the difficulties of Mississippi and got credit for their 1963 witness to boot, while those who remained in the state have only received kudos in recent years, some posthumously. The former left the state behind and proudly displayed the Born of Conviction badge of honor, while the latter kept their connection to Mississippi Methodism and, in John Ed Thomas's words, put Born of Conviction behind them. Those who came from far away to the 2005 reunion did so partially to recover something they had lost, to relive a past struggle, and in some cases to deal with their own anger at a community that had rejected them, while those who came from within Mississippi struggled with different feelings. All had paid a price, but each individual story contained its own unique plot. 8 years later, as the group of signers and family members waited in the hall to go into the annual conference for the Elsie Award ceremony, a friend passed Margaret Thomas and congratulated her. John Ed had died in the interim. She smiled and said with humor, "You know what John Ed would have said about this." In her view, Thomas did not think he deserved recognition for something he should have done anyway. In February 2006, I gave a lecture on Born of Conviction at Millsaps College to an audience of more than 100 people, and Thomas, Elton Brown, and Rod Entrican attended. When the lecture ended, I noted their presence, and they received a tremendous ovation. During the question period, Thomas said, "I appreciate your recognizing us, but there's a person here today who did a lot more than we did. Eddie King deserves our recognition." The audience then applauded Ed King, Mississippi Civil Rights Movement leader and Thomas's Millsaps contemporary and ministerial colleague. When I interviewed Ed King a few months before talking with surviving signers who had left the state, he asked me to thank them for what they had done. This proved important to Ed and Martina McRae in California. He expressed some guilt at not being a good enough friend to King in the annual conference in the early 1960s, and she spoke of how she had been unwilling to put her body on the line as her Millsaps contemporary King and many others had done. They appreciated hearing of King's gratitude and his view that public words from white moderates played an important role in 1963 Mississippi. Given its particular time and context, Born of Conviction played an important role in the larger ecology of myriad efforts to change race relations in the state, and more to the point, to change white attitudes toward blacks and their freedom struggle. And the signers deserved credit for that prophetic word. Yet the statement was only a first step on a long journey to see what we can create that would be inclusive. It took me too long to finish this book, over 12 years from first research to book release. But there were reasons why it was good I waited this long. I would not have been able to include the story I just read you if I'd finished earlier. And as you'll see when you read it, and I do trust that you're going to read it, I also wouldn't have been able to offer an important story in the last chapter of something that happened in 2013-14 related to the legacy of this statement and how it continues. It took me a long time, but in the words of a 1970s commercial, we will serve no book before it's time. Thank you.